So is it bad to look at the generosity of the people who give at your church? If you talk to a lot of pastors, many of them will say that they do not look at their giving reports. They have no idea how much people actually give. But is that actually a good idea? In this episode, we actually take the opposite approach, and we'll give you 5 reasons why you should actually check the generosity of your givers.
Welcome back to Practical Church Planting, where in 15 minutes or less, we'll give you practical tips, advice, and encouragement to help you plant and grow healthy churches. My name is Brian Androsi, and joining me today and every day is Dylan Dodson.
Every day.
And today we're talking about 5 reasons why you should look at the generosity of your givers.
Yeah, so what we mean by that is by saying that you as a church leader or if you're a pastor, we would recommend you actually looking at the giving reports.
Yes.
Who gives what? Nothing to look at it like every second of every day. But there's kind of a trend, for better or for worse, that pastors will often say, I don't look at the giving, or I'll only look at the general giving, but not anyone specific or whatever, like anything like that.
Yeah.
This episode, we're not saying it's wrong or right to do either one. I do look at the giving at New City Church, and so in this episode, we wanted to share a few reasons why we actually think that's a good idea and why you shouldn't refrain from looking and seeing what people give.
Right.
So here we go. Number 1, this one, when I first heard this, because before we planned New City Church, I often heard people say, I don't look at the giving. It's like whatever reason. I don't want to judge people. I don't want to favoritism, which all legit, whatever.
Yeah.
And I heard somebody say this as arguing why you should, if you're the pastor. He said, you look at most everything else in their life.
Yeah.
So they'll talk to you
Right.
about their sexual issues, regrets, mistakes they've made, sins they've committed, everything else. So why can't you look at the giving? We look at everything else in their life, and it's helpful, in order for you to lead and to shepherd and to love people well, to know what's going on in their life. We look at everything else, so why don't we also look at their giving?
Yeah.
And I was like, that is a really good point, because I'd always just heard people say, well, I just don't look at it, and we'll talk about reasons why that might be, some of these other reasons. But I think it's just suffice to say, maybe you never thought of it this way, like I didn't, that you look at everything else that people will come to you with all these sorts of issues. So what's the difference between knowing about all their other issues, whether good or bad, and not knowing about their generosity?
Yeah, and not only look at other issues, but a lot of times you look at financial issues. Like, it's not uncommon for people to talk about whether it's in marriage counseling or things like that, or them having financial issues. So it's not like being involved in someone's financial life for having some knowledge of that is completely foreign to a pastor.
Right.
So, that's
a great point. Like, what's the biggest reason people get divorced?
Right.
Finances. And so you look at most everything else, other struggles, other things they're going with. So why exclude one really big part of people's lives?
Yeah.
If you want to actually know how your church is doing, knowing how people are doing overall, you look at everything else. It would therefore seem wise to also look at something that has a big impact on their life as well.
Makes sense.
And so that goes right into the second point, and that's this, that people's generosity is a huge measure of their spiritual maturity. Now, the caveat for this is obviously to hope that you're doing this for the right motives and not to like hang it up people's heads, like you should give more, how dare you, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But we all know Jesus talks about money like more than anything else. He says where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What you do with your money leads your heart and not the other way around. And so how people give is a huge measure of their spiritual maturity. If they are increasing their giving, that's something you should celebrate. And if you never look at their giving, you don't know that people are doing that. If they're giving for the first time, if they give a large amount, some people are like, well, I don't want to know what my large givers are, but you know who serves the most at your church. Like, you know who's good at all these other things. Why not know who's good at giving? It's a huge measure for that. So again, if you have somebody, and we might have said this in a previous episode, but like when people want to meet with me because they've got a problem with the church going on, I look to see if they're in a group. I look to see if they're serving, and I always look to see if they're giving. What you'll often find is a lot of people that complain a lot, and we're not talking about there was a change and they were offended, but there's just people that complain a lot in your church. Often the people that complain the most have given nothing. I remember we had a family who was with us for the entire first year, and there was a few complaints about how we did things, whatever, and finally the guy wanted to meet with me. And so I didn't, as I look at giving, but I don't always like go through everybody's individual thing.
Yeah.
So I looked to see how much she was giving before I met. I just assumed that they had given stuff. They had never given a penny.
Yeah.
And they were with us from the launch phase all the way through the entire first year after we launch. And so it really goes to show that they're not invested. We're not talking about the amount that they had given. They just hadn't given anything. So it showed that, okay, the issue is not so much the church. They're just not invested here, and they need to be somewhere that they are.
Yeah.
And so just the spiritual maturity, if someone's not giving, if they're giving for the first time, or if their giving is growing, there's signs of health. And so you can't know that if you never look at who's giving.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And you're not just, like you said, you're not just talking about who you're not just looking at this from a negative standpoint, I guess. I think it's easy to hear that and think like, oh, so you want to see who is not spiritually mature or who seems like they are, but they're really not because they're not giving and things like that. But really, this is a positive thing. You can see the people that are increasing their generosity and are taking these steps that maybe to some people, they've never taken these steps in their life before, and doing these cool things that you can celebrate with them. So I think a lot of times when we're talking about looking at money, it's like, oh, I don't want to offend people, or I don't want to, like you said, I don't want to judge them because they're not giving, and I think they are, or don't want to look at them differently. But a lot of times there's really good things that can come out of it as well.
And like, just to give you an example, we've had a family that was complaining about some things recently, both the husband and wife, and we're like, I mean, we don't know what's going on here.
Yeah.
We talked to them recently. I've noticed that they give every week, and recently their giving increased, which shows, okay, there's probably some good things happening, that they're more bought in, that things are going, like, there's just things that you can't see if you don't see it. And it's a huge marker. Again, you have to be mature as you're looking at it yourself.
Yeah, for sure.
Of people's spiritual maturity, not because some people deserve favoritism over others, but it's a huge marker of whether or not someone is following and trusting in Jesus.
Yeah.
And again, you track I think you understand what I mean by track. It's not like you're like sitting down and looking at everyone's personal life, but you look at everything that other people are doing. You should also look at their generosity, because that plays a big part.
Yeah, and I mean, as part of a pastor, you're supposed to be shepherding people. And so if this is a marker of their spiritual maturity, that's kind of your responsibility to at least know somewhat, not necessarily have every detail about, but at least know somewhat of this marker that is marking kind of the thing that you are entrusted to be almost in charge over. I mean, biblically, that's something that you're supposed to be guiding people through.
Yeah. So. And this is not a point, but as a side note, I also did wonder if I would look at people, maybe judge them, and I would just say for me, it actually hasn't been a thing for me at all. I would say it's quite the opposite. It's actually a really good thing. But that was a worry for me not to do it. Yeah. And just in the 2+ years that New City's been around, it actually hasn't been an issue with me. Not because I'm great. I think a lot of people could handle this a lot better because you're a pastor because you actually care about people. And so I don't think it's that big of a deal. Yeah. So that's number 2. It's a huge measure of people's spiritual maturity. Number 3, it alerts you to issues that people may be dealing with. So for example, again, if somebody is serving and they stop serving, there might be a crisis, they might have a disagreement, something might have happened to them, and because you know who's serving, who's not, maybe who's in a community group or who's doing whatever, if something tracks or doesn't happen or somebody does it for the first time, you celebrate that step, that's awesome. If you have no idea who is giving what at your church, you don't know if they've given for the first time. So you don't know if you should celebrate with them, if they're increasing their generosity, or if they stop giving. Most of the time, if somebody completely stops giving, it's because something happened. Yeah. It's probably not just because they left the church, because you probably know, especially if you're a smaller church, who's there and who's not. But if you never look at giving, you might not know that someone lost a job, or you might not know that something difficult happened to them. But if you notice, oh, they're giving and then they're not, it allows you to reach out in a loving manner and say, hey, is there anything that we can help with? What's going on? We noticed that this is a significant change. We just want to know. You're not asking because you're wanting their money. You're asking because it's clearly something happened in their life. And if you don't look at the giving, you'll never know if that's happening.
Yeah, I think, how do I put this? I think if you're really invested in people's lives already, and then an issue comes up, like you said, like someone who's giving consistently, maybe even has automatic giving, and then it's cut off, and they're still attending, and so it's kind of like, that's kind of weird that it happened. I think a lot of times for guys, it's a lot easier for us not to say anything. For us not to say like, hey, there's an issue going on, and not wanting to seek out help for it.
Yep.
But if you're, I don't know, if you're going to be invested in someone's life, you kind of need to be able to see these different markers. And we have them, at least in our church, set up in different ways. In other words, we have like community group leaders are kind of, if there's a big change going on in someone's life, that that the person's okay with sharing. In other words, not like a very confidential issue, but something that the church should be aware of, whether it's a divorce going on or someone losing a job, something that we could pray over. It's kind of their responsibility to let us know as staff so that we can be praying for it and reaching out to them. This is another way that really no one else is going to see other than the person who's looking at these.
Right.
So this is another thing where you can see and say, hey, there might be something going on here, not necessarily something that they're doing sinfully, but maybe there's just a struggle going on in their life that they're not really open enough to share, but you can at least start praying for, or maybe reach out to them and offer to help and be that kind of first contact.
Right. So again, just exactly. A lot of times people stop giving or reduce it abruptly. There's an issue.
Yeah.
If you never look at giving, you don't know. And sometimes there's not an issue. There has been multiple times, because I don't know if that number is correct. Maybe you could correct me. 80% or more of our giving is online. Where people's cards will get declined.
Yeah, true.
And it's because they changed their credit card. They didn't know. And because I was like, oh, this is being declined, just a heads up. There's been times where people legitimately would not have known for maybe a few months.
Yeah.
And maybe they'll go back and give all that money, but chances are they won't. And so even for like mistakes like that,
for sure,
it's a good thing to know. Bigger issue is that it alerts you with things that are going on in people's life that you would not see if you didn't ever take a look at it.
Yeah.
Number 4, and this is kind of a joke, but I think you see what I mean. There's no law against it. And what I mean by that is a lot of pastors just seem to say, I don't look at the giving, and it can make you think maybe you just thought like but for some reason you were not supposed to do it.
Yeah.
There is no handbook. There's nowhere in Scripture. No, it never says don't look at what people are giving. And so maybe this is an obvious one, but I have no idea. Just to remind people that there's actually, maybe if you're a new church planter and you've only ever heard church pastors say, I don't look at giving because of whatever reason, you might just assume that that's not something you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
Just to tell you there's no law against it, so you actually can do it.
Yeah, there's a lot of checks and procedures and stuff that we have and that you should have regarding money, especially when it comes to the pastor. Like, in other words, Dylan at New City isn't allowed to count the money or take the money to the bank, not because of any past anything, but just to be above reproach. And in case anything happens, obviously the first look is always going to be to him, and so you got to make sure to protect him. But this is something that doesn't fall under that. I think a lot of times we can just think like all money things pastor is out of, but physically sure, but you can to be able to look at the maturity of the people that you're leading and see who's giving and things like that. That doesn't really fall.
Yeah. Again, I know we already said it, but there's just so much rides on the heart of people, and their generosity reveals that. And there's so many things that I think you miss out on knowing if you don't ever take a look at who's giving and how the giving's going and what's happening. It's more than just making sure that you can keep the lights on or pay rent or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
It's actually looking at people's hearts and minds and seeing how they're doing, and you just can't see such a pivotal part of people's spiritual journey if you never look at it.
Yeah.
So just to say, number 4, there's no law against it. Like, there's no word that says you can't actually do this. So consider that.
Yep.
And then number 5, if I'm being honest, I think this is also the reason sometimes, is that it might be your pride being the reason that you don't look at it. And I don't want to judge people's heart, just like I don't want people to judge mine, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes the way I've heard people talk about how they don't look at their giving, it's kind of like, I'm super spiritual and holy, and I don't want to be, show favoritisms, and they'll kind of like give all these reasons why they don't look at their giving. And I'm like, but why do you got to say it like that?
Yeah.
It's like why do you got to tell everybody that you don't look at their giving? Like and so I would just say like maybe it could actually be a pride thing that you think that it's more spiritual or whatever for whatever reason not to look at it. And so my hope is that if you're convicted not to look at it, that's fine. But you would actually answer the question why, and don't let your pride get in the way because you want to like maybe uphold this image to people or to your staff or whatever that you're above it.
And I would say if you feel legitimately convicted about this, in other words, you think, I see these points, however, I know myself, and I feel like if I start seeing these, I will look people in a different light, and I don't want to run into that. There's other things you can do. In other words, like appoint somebody on staff to monitor these things or something like that, to where if I hate to say like if you legitimately feel personally convicted, you shouldn't. I'd hate to say something like that. So if you do, there are different ways to do this. It's not, but I don't think it's a matter of just if you feel convicted, then just ignore it.
Right.
But there's other ways you can go about it. Are you going to appoint someone on staff to monitor these things that only kind of report to you if they see an issue?
Right.
Or ways to go around it. So don't let your pride get in the way, but live by your convictions.
That's right. I mean, that's a great point. Find somebody to say, hey, monitor this. I think, again, obviously I don't have the conviction otherwise. I think it's easier to do it if you just, instead of having to go through third party, especially because, if you're a church planter and you're not leading a massive church, you probably know most of the people that are giving, and you might have some idea of what's going on in their life. And so it's just easier to notice these differences if you're looking at it. And so again, there's no law against it, and just don't let your pride. And I would say, maybe just try it for a month. Next month, just say, I'm going to look at the giving. I'm not even going to look at everybody's giving all year. I'm just going to look at the giving this month and see if it actually affects you the way you think it will in a negative sense. And if it doesn't, you now have a better way to help disciple your people because you see how it's going.
And I think if you've never looked at it before, I think you'll be pleasantly impressed with your people. In other words, I think that you won't look at people in the sense of, oh, these people this person gives a lot, so you treat them differently, but more just, I don't know. Not that you think that your people aren't spiritually mature, but I think you'll be impressed to see that, like, hey, there are people that I really didn't think they would be giving this because of their situation or just because of their age, maybe, or things like that. But really, they are. And I think you can see some really cool things.
Yeah, like it just makes you be grateful and allows you to encourage people in ways that you couldn't encourage them if you hadn't seen that.
For sure.
Again, we would encourage it. We think it's a good idea. This episode of 5 Reasons Why You Should Look at the Generosity of Your Givers. Thanks for listening today. You can join the Practical Church Planting Facebook group.
Yeah. Please do.
If you want to talk more, or what would be really awesome, leave a rating and review if you find this helpful so that other people can find it.
Yeah.
And we'll be with you next time on Practical Church Planting.
Thanks so much for watching this episode of Practical Church Planning. Whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or Practical Planning, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, make sure you like or subscribe or do whatever it's telling you to do or should do on that platform.
And hey, if you are so tired of looking at our ugly faces, but you're not tired of listening to our beautiful voices, then you can find our podcast if you just search Practical Church Planning on iTunes or Google Play. Make sure not to just find it, not just to listen, but to subscribe.
Make sure you subscribe. Brian, tell them to subscribe.
Subscribe.
See you next time.